Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Ich warte seit Wochen auf diesen Tag und tanz vor Freude über den Asphalt. Als wär's ein Rhythmus, als gäb's ein Lied, das mich immer weiter durch die Straßen zieht. Komm dir entgegen.
Hello and welcome to the Gegenpressing Transfer Roundup Show. My name is Stefan Binkowski and he's Manu Veit. Manu, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing all right. How about you? All good?
Yeah, cannot complain. It's almost the end of the weekend. Almost the end of the week, rather. So always a little optimistic. I always feel like I have a kind of spring in my step when we do this show because it's always like the end of the week. The hard work's kind of been done. I already have plans for what I'm doing at the weekend. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, you're a little bit ahead of me. I guess it's Thursday night for you. Thursday morning, so I still have to slug through all of Thursday and all of Friday. But we're getting there. It's almost the weekend, and it's actually our last free weekend, I guess, before the Bundesliga kicks off. Then we have to watch games again. Have to.
A tricky thing
it's
called
tough
football.
life.
Yeah. It's a bit kind of weird when we do these podcasts because I always record it basically at the end of the day. You record it at the start of the day, which is exactly why, as some listeners have pointed out, you can often sometimes hear me yawning because we do record it quite late in the day for me. But yeah, I feel fine right now. And yeah, we got a whole bunch of transfer questions and stories and rumours to get stuck into. So I guess we'll just kind of jump straight into that, Manu, right after this break.
This episode of the Gegenpressing podcast is brought to you by BetOnline. Basketball is back, and BetOnline remains your number one source for all your sports betting needs this season. You will always find the latest odds, team matchup info, player news, and game trends at BetOnline. And is your continued source for all sports wagering information. BetOnline features live betting, free contests, and giveaways all season long. Always the fastest and easiest way to bet all your favorite sports and events, whether that's NFL, NBA, NHL, MMA, tennis, boxing, or even golf. Head to betonline.ag to join and receive your 50% welcome bonus with your first deposit. Make sure to promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, to receive your rewards. That's it, BLEAV, to receive your rewards. Bet Online, where the game starts.
So the first question here is, about Bayern Munich, which, as always, we did beg our listeners not to talk about Manuel Neuer, and sure enough, they have done that. One subscriber did ask us if we thought he was any good at skiing, which I think we could probably save for another podcast. But this one question here is quite good. It says, do Bayern really need to get a right-back replacement for Pavard? Assuming Mazraoui fully recovers, at what point do they let Stanisic play? He looks solid. Some of the games he's played for Croatia seem deserving of a shot, or at least to be loaned out to develop. So it's quite an interesting topic right now, Manu, because Bayern have a whole list of injuries, but when it comes to right back, they're actually possibly contending with one of their kind of senior players moving on, which would leave them with only one kind of experienced player there. So does Stanisic get the call up, or do you think they're going to move him on and get someone else in?
Well, I do think that they're going to sign another centre back, right? Which is probably where they're going to see their Benjamin Pavard replacement. And that player may be similar to what they did with Dale Blind on the left side, right? Someone who can maybe play multiple positions. And this could be a short-term fix. This could be something that they look into a little bit more long-term. What actually thought was quite interesting, we looked into this before the show, right? Stefan was for Stanisic. He can actually play all four roles in the back four. Left back, center back right, center back left, and right back, right? He has played one game there for Croatia during the World Cup. Junuzovic was the number one choice there, who plays for Celtic, and so it was hard for him to get past that. But I think you look at Stanisic's development, you either trust the player or you move him on and give him the opportunity to play somewhere else, right? I think that's essentially where we are at with him right now. My indication is that we're looking at a similar kind of thing that Bayern did with Daley Blind. If they do something in the winter, bring in some experienced player who can maybe help out in the short term, perhaps can play multiple roles, add some depth. And then they're going to look and see what's going to happen with Benjamin Pavard if he indeed does move on in the summer, which I think is the likeliest scenario at the moment. I think that all parties have come sort of to the conclusion that it's time to end this chapter and do something different. And Barcelona are knocking heavily on the door, although I'm not quite sure how they have any money left and which financial levers they're going to pull now to get any of these signings across. But they are very interested in the player. And so, my indication with that is that once Benjamin Pavard does move on, they're going to give Stanisic the opportunity to compete there, but at the same time, they're still going to be open and looking for another player.
Yeah. I think with Stanisic, I do sometimes wonder if he's almost a victim of his own usefulness. He's kind of like a jack of all trades without really being a master of any of them. He obviously came through in the youth side, if I'm not mistaken, at Bayern. I think he actually started as a central defender, then he's played left back at times. And then he very much became a right back, but in the senior team, he's kind of been this player who can kind of play across the back line, which has perhaps got in the way of him developing into a very specific defender. I do kind of wonder whether he ever has really shown that he's good enough to play for Bayern on the long term, which is perhaps why someone like Mazraoui was signed at the end of the day. So, I mean, Daley Blind's joined the club might suggest that they're not specifically worried about right back, and the fact that since Blind can obviously play at central defence, it might mean Stanisic does kind of develop into that kind of backup right back, and he just kind of competes with Mazraoui for that role. But yeah, as you said, they might have to bring in another central defender, and there's obviously the fact that like Matthijs de Ligt, for example, still hasn't really got going at Bayern either. So
yeah.
It's all up in the air, to be perfectly honest with you. But if I was Stanisic, I think I would probably be pushing for some sort of kind of confirmation that you can get some game time. If he wants to be an understudy to Mazraoui, then fair enough. But if not, I'm sure there's plenty of big Bundesliga sides that would be more than happy to pick him up. Strikes me as a player who would just, I don't know why, but Gladbach keeps popping into my head. Maybe it's because that's the next question. But a club like that, although they've already got a good right back, but that kind of level might be exactly what he needs, because even Philip Lahm had to move on and get game time, or Joshua Kimmich, Serge Gnabry, all these guys had to go get game time at some point because the path to the first team just wasn't open for them. So yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if he moved on this summer, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, I think the one thing to add here is that Stanisic is of course born and raised in Munich, right? He does play for Croatia, but he is a Munich boy. And I think the club, this is maybe something that they are a little bit wary of, that there isn't many players that have come through to the academy and actually made the first team. Of course, I think they are counting Jamal Musiala, although I think they cheated that path a little bit. The two before that was David Alaba and Thomas Müller, right? And only Thomas Müller is actually a Munich boy. So I think that is something that they're a little bit wary of, and that's maybe why he's going to get a few more opportunities. And also the other thing is keep in mind, Stanisic he has only played that one game for Croatia, right? But like at the same time, he was part of that side, and as a Croatian national team player, he will get a lot of exposure for a country that does very well in tournaments. So I could see them say, "Look, this is your job to lose."
Yeah, absolutely. Another club who are potentially looking at a lot of kind of transfer news and a lot of transfer kind of speculation and movement this window are Gladbach. I kind of joked on Twitter the other day that no one seems to want to stay at Gladbach. And it's kind of one of those situations where we're the last person at the club, turn the light off before they leave. But there's been so much speculation over their key players, Manu, in the last couple of weeks. We've obviously talked about Jan Sommer endlessly. He seems to be Bayern's preference to replace Manuel Neuer in the short term, which we've talked about in previous podcasts. So I don't think there's really much to add to that. We even talked about it actually in the bonus show this week. So yeah, you can go back and look at that. Of course, Marcus Thuram is another big player who's been linked. I think he's been linked to Chelsea and Barcelona, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, there's Kone as well, the defensive midfielder or box-to-box midfielder, however you want to call it, label him. And he's been linked with quite a lot of Premier League clubs, but also in the last couple of days, RB Leipzig have been heavily linked with him as a potential signing. Where and I guess the question here is, they're obviously moving on the left back as well, who's apparently meant to be moving on to Dortmund. So the question is, who will be replacing all these players? And there appears to be quite a lot of turnover. And he obviously, the subscriber whose name I don't think I have to hand, says, Luca Netz is a potential replacement for the Dortmund going left back. Sorry. So yeah, where does this leave Gladbach, Manu?
Well, with a lot of holes to fill. As you said, that's a lot of players that are reportedly on the move. And I think that quite a lot of these stories have a lot of legs. I mean, Marcus Thuram is the latest player linked to Chelsea. At some point, working for Transfermarkt, I'm worried that we're basically just reporting on Chelsea transfers these days. It's because there's so many of them, but he's been heavily linked to Chelsea. Not sure why, to be honest, because they have secured the signing of Christopher Nkunku. Right, that deal is across the line, and I'm not sure why Marcus Thuram then needs to go to Chelsea if he pretty much fills that same space. But well, you never quite know with them, right? So then there is the Bensebaini, who is eternally linked to Borussia Dortmund. That deal hasn't gotten anywhere closer. I actually think that if Dortmund are smart, Stefan, they would go after Lucas Netz instead. Right, that would probably be a signing that has a lot more upside. He's a young German international, youth international, I should say. He's a player that, because of that, will develop in terms of market value significantly, especially if he makes that first team. There's not many Germans in that position that are in front of him, right? So if he does play for a top club, he could probably make that German national team pretty quickly with regular game time. So I'm actually kind of surprised Dortmund are not going after him instead. Having said that, if Bensebaini leaves, Gladbach have a fantastic prospect at hand. And that is a very good player developed by Hertha Berlin. Berlin is one of those cities that develop a lot of young talent. So I think, they're quite happy to maybe cash in on some of the other assets. The one that I think, and this is probably the most interesting one, Stefan, is Manu Kone. Market value 25 million euros, right? And he looks like a Leipzig player already in so many ways. And Max Eberl is, of course, now the sporting director at Leipzig. I just wonder if Eberl knows something about Kone's contract that we don't.
Do you think that's potentially why Leipzig have kind of jumped in here in the 11th hour, even though he's been linked to, I think Liverpool's a club he's been linked to quite heavily? Do you think maybe Leipzig might be able to kind of just squeeze in there ahead of the queue and nab him before they really know what's going on?
Well, there's insider knowledge going on here, right? Eberl signed the guy originally from Toulouse for Gladbach. I think he went then back on loan first, and then arrived at Gladbach, and has been an outstanding player ever since. Yet another French talent that is just looking magnificent, right? And how well Leipzig does with French players. They have a track record of developing them really well. They are going to lose Konrad Laimer to Bayern Munich. And I think if you lose Konrad Laimer and you bring in Manu Kone, that's a net. You look better on the other end of that deal. And let's say, okay, his market value, Manu Kone's market value right now is 25 million euros. I'm alluding to an exit clause. I don't know if it exists or not. I just say that Eberl probably knows this. He knows this contract better than anyone else because he was the one who signed it. But they are getting these 70 million euros for Nkunku, right? That is good money invested because Leipzig don't need to sign a striker. They have the Nkunku succession already figured out. So they could take that money and say, oh yeah, Laimer is going to leave us, who, by the way, hasn't really been featured much for Leipzig anyways. And we can just plug this kid from Gladbach and we'll actually look better by the time the dust settles.
Yeah, I completely agree. It seems like a pretty obvious deal, especially you wouldn't usually expect Gladbach to sell a player to Leipzig happily. You'd probably expect him to demand a sizable fee, and you would expect maybe Kone to demand a sizable fee, but Leipzig do actually have a good track record of kind of snapping up these kind of Bundesliga talents. We saw it with David Raum actually last year, when it seemed as though Dortmund and Bayern Munich were, at each other's necks to sign this guy. Then Leipzig kind of slide in there, and very, very quickly they're able to kind of snap them up. We actually have a question later on the show to kind of specifically talk about Leipzig, so I'll kind of bite my tongue there and just kind of move on to another player the question asked about, which is Marcus Thuram. And I actually do think Gladbach might have some sort of exit strategy here for him. So although he's been linked with Chelsea and Barcelona, the reports in Germany kind of suggest that he doesn't actually want to leave in January. He's kind of pushing for a summer move when his contract expires. I think it's Chelsea in particular who are trying to sign him now, and I think he's a bit apprehensive about maybe making that move when everything just seems to be up in the air at Stamford Bridge. And interestingly enough, Gladbach have been in this kind of winter break been experimenting with their forward line, and Daniel Fark kind of made a point of playing Ngumu, who was the winger that they signed from Toulouse in the summer transfer window. They made a habit of playing him as a central forward, and he kind of lavished him with praise after the game. He said he reminded him a little bit of Aubameyang as a young player, which is no small thing coming from Daniel Fark, and of course you know how well he did at Dortmund and in the Bundesliga. And even though he said, Nathan's natural position is on the right flank, I think it's probably important for us to start trying to play him as a central forward, because we relied so heavily on Marcus Thuram in the first half of the season. I think he said something like, we beat every second of the games out of Marcus Thuram. So I think he's quite politically saying, oh, well, we can't just have one striker playing up front all games, every weekend. We need to have some sort of support, but perhaps behind closed doors, he's thinking, right, well, I'm obviously going to lose this guy either this month or in 6 months' time, probably more so in 6 months' time. So let's try and develop this winger that we have into some sort of pacey forward and see if that works. So things at Gladbach look quite concerning, but they may end up getting a good price for Kone. They might have a replacement for Thuram in 6 months' time, and they've also got a very exciting left back coming through. So as ever, Manu, it seems like Gladbach, every time they kind of lose a star player, they've got two younger ones coming through, and maybe that's why they're called the Foals.
Well, yeah, that was the traditional name, right? There used to be the young foals. The foals, I guess, foals is a young horse. But that's a tradition. That's a name that goes back to the 70s when the Jungen Fohlen, when they were the team that produced, unlike Bayern, or so at least that was the perception. It's actually not true when you look into it into detail. Bayern Munich and Gladbach produced all their players themselves. There wasn't actually that much signing done back then, but the Foals was the nickname of the team because they had such a good academy, which is something that they have struggled with in recent decades. I don't even want to say recent years. I want to say recent decades, because they haven't really produced a young player themselves in quite some time. So you kind of hope that maybe they can get back to that, right? We had Freddy Bobic on earlier this show about the lack of youth development in German football. And there's quite a few clubs that maybe need to get back to these roots. And I actually toss Gladbach in that, because although Gladbach itself isn't a big city, they're part of a very big metropolitan region. You know it quite well, Stefan. You've lived there, right? So there's a lot of young players that you could probably find there. And I think they need to kind of get back to that. And if you can throw in a young guy like Lucas Netz, even though they haven't really developed him himself either. I think that's probably something they want to get back to the roots too. I think a lot of German clubs kind of want to do this, and they kind of maybe have to in order to be competitive with the Premier League. I remember you a few years ago wrote an article on this, actually. I remember reading it when the Bundesliga signed their big TV deal and then started to spend a lot more money rather than developing their own players. I think maybe it's time to go back to that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think Gladbach have always kind of, at least under Eberl, they had I mean, they were able to take advantage of just simple geography, I think. Gladbach. It's interesting you say they're part of a large metropolitan area, because when I think of Gladbach, I think of it being in the middle of nowhere, to be honest with you. It is technically next to Cologne, but it's also very far away from Cologne. It's also quite isolated. Maybe I'm just thinking of the stadium itself. And the town itself's not very big. But I think Gladbach were able to get ahead because they're obviously, the proximity to Holland, for example, was just across the border. And I think obviously France isn't too far away as well. So they're obviously, I think they, more than most German clubs, were able to kind of jump on that kind of Ligue 1 and Eredivisie, bandwagon, or just grab up these young players who are developing there and say, well, if you come play for us, you're only maybe 3 or 4 hours from your house, from your home. So, they've kind of got that. And maybe that's why they kind of put a bit more emphasis on that rather than developing their own players. So, but I think it's an interesting question. I think especially after, obviously, Eberl's moved on to RB Leipzig and the kind of constant turnover of head coaches that they've had in recent years, I think there probably is something of a kind of identity crisis at Gladbach that probably has to be fixed. To the extent that they have to kind of figure out what kind of club are they one of these kind of smart analytical clubs? Are they more of a community club, like for example like Freiburg or Union Berlin, and they trade on that, or are they a club that want to be more ambitious, maybe like a Frankfurt, who, because they still do get a very good crowd every week, so they've got a huge support. They've also got a huge support. They've got a huge historic support in Germany as well, largely based on what you kind of said there couple of minutes ago about the way they used to go toe-to-toe with Bayern Munich. It'll be really interesting to see what they do. But I think actually, as down as I have been on Gladbach in some time now, I kind of think that squad's okay. I think Daniel Fark's doing a pretty decent job there. I know, I think results have been kind of back and forth, and they have kind of regressed to the mean a little bit and kind of dropped back into that mid-table. But I think that's fine for the time being while they kind of transition into something new. The next question is on Leverkusen, and actually I'll probably grab this one, Manu, just because I've got a bit of inside info on this one. So subscriber says, Noah Mbamba to Leverkusen, what do you think? And then he says, do you think Leverkusen can still make top 7 given that Wirtz is back and they've been in good form recently? So what I've been told is that Noah Mbamba is basically done. So he's a kind of young 18-year-old defensive midfielder from, I think it's Club Brugge, if I'm not mistaken. It's
Club Brugge, yeah.
It's Club Brugge, yeah. So they have got that deal signed and sorted, but I don't think we should expect to see him join the club until the summer. So I think it was Kicker who initially reported the story. And I think that's a really smart signing in the sense. It's a very kind of Leverkusen signing. It's this kind of young player who they've managed to pick up, joins the club, and then we were joking before we came on air, is one of these players you'll probably end up moving for 40 or 50 million euros before anyone even really knows what he is. But that seems to be kind of done and dusted. And I think another important one that's probably worth mentioning here as well is Piero Hincapié, who, at least in the English press, has been heavily linked with a move in January. I'm not entirely sure why he keeps getting brought up in these conversations. He's been linked with Chelsea, with Tottenham.
World Cup.
Well, yeah, and I think
that's why it's the World Cup, Stefan.
Yeah, I think as well his age and his profile also means he gets included in a lot of these kind of analytical shortlists that club scouts and data analysts kind of put together. They say, well, this guy's got X amount of minutes in the Bundesliga. He's still very young, actually, if I'm not mistaken. He's only 21. He just turned 21, actually. And, he's obviously quite highly regarded in Germany as well. The reality is that, obviously, as any Leverkusen fan will tell you, he's by no means the finished article. And there's still quite a lot of work for him to be done, which you can say about almost all that Leverkusen team. So much potential, so much talent, but by no means the finished product. But what I've been told by folk at the club is that, look, they appreciate there's a lot of attention, but he's going nowhere. He's got a really long-term contract, 2026. I don't think there's a release clause. I can't say for certain if there is, but they're very confident that he's going nowhere. So, yeah, to kind of sum that all up, I would say, I don't really expect Leverkusen to make a lot of big signings in January. They've already kind of snapped up Mbamba for the summer. but I don't think they're going to make any sales either. And I think for them, and especially for Xabi Alonso and for Florian Wirtz, it's just a case of just kind of getting that squad back on the pitch, getting everyone back fit and ready. And as we've kind of talked about for much of the season, as we talked about going into the season, Leverkusen think they have one of the best squads in the league, and they're still convinced that they do. They're still entirely myth as to why it didn't work out under the last manager, but there's no real reason why they would sell or buy new players right now, because they probably feel like they've already got enough talent to get them where they have to be.
Yeah. And I think they're right, personally, Stefan. I think they're absolutely right about that assessment. I spent some time with them in the US right after the first half of the season ended, and was able to talk to some people there about this. And also got to see Xabi Alonso work firsthand, which was really fascinating too. And I think they're quite right in that assessment. I think Florian Wirtz, in the training sessions that I saw him, he looked really good. He's since played in friendlies, right? And I think for that, like, he's like a world-class signing for them now, coming back from that injury. And a player who, we have spoken so highly this entire season about Jamal Musiala and what he has done and how impactful he has been for Bayern Munich. Florian Wirtz is probably just as good, right? And that's the kind of player that Bayer Leverkusen are getting back. And that's, I think, quite huge for them. It looks like they're also going to be able to keep Callum Hudson-Odoi, right? That's a player that we also featured quite a bit. And I think, you look at that squad from top to bottom, with the exception of maybe the goalkeeper, but I think that's something that they want to maybe address at some point soon as well. This is a really good team. And the question asked whether they could make the top 7. I wouldn't be shocked if they make the top 5.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even have a league table to hand, and it's been about 4 months since I've thought about the Bundesliga league table. But let me just pull it up there. Yeah, there's. I do remember going into the kind of winter break that there's so much. There's very little going into it, and yeah, there's currently seven points off 6th place, 9 points off 5th. No, I completely agree with you. I mean, Leverkusen's always a case of looking for consistency. And I think that's obviously, and they've got all the tools to hand to do that in the second half of the season. Would not be surprised at all if they do kind of fly up that league table. And if they don't, Xabi Alonso won't be long for his job there, and they'll find someone else to replace him in the summer. But yeah, I completely agree with you. I think we can't really overstate just how important Florian Wirtz is for that team. You're completely right. It's the equivalent of Jamal Musiala just getting dropped into that team and getting asked to fix things, because I think we both agree they are comparable talents. So that's the kind of player we're talking here. And let's not forget that, I doubt our listeners need to be reminded of how good Jamal Musiala has been this season, but he's quite literally Bayern Munich's top goal scorer. He's top goal scorer and playmaker. So we're talking about a player who's arguably as good as the best player in the league right now. So yeah, I think Leverkusen, I think they're very calm. I think they're very collected. I think they're quite happy. I think the winter break would have came at the perfect time for them. And I'm sure Xabi Alonso's been working quite hard in the background. But yeah, I don't really expect Hincapié to move on. And I think they should be okay in the second half of the season. But I guess you never really know with Leverkusen to a large extent. But let's move on to the next question. We got one here on Mainz. So they've been linked with a South Korean player, Manu, Gusong Cho. He's also been linked with Celtic and Minnesota. And our subscriber says, Gusong Cho, I hope I pronounced that properly, to Mainz, ? I fear Celtic or even Minnesota United might price us out of a move, but badly needed a striker due to injuries to Burkhardt. Now, before I let you jump in there, because I know you do have some information on this, I'm just going to quickly jump in here and say that there was an update on Burkhardt that Christian Heidel gave, and he basically said they expect him back after 2 games. So, I know he kind of had a big injury, and I think there's maybe a setback as well. I think they're kind of hoping that he'd be able to come back for the second half of the season, but he's going to be back after 2 games. I think they said he's currently in rehabilitation in Munich right now. So I'll let you kind of jump in on this, Manu, because, obviously Minnesota are a team that you cover quite extensively, and yeah, do you think he's moving to Mainz? Do you think he's moving to MLS, or do you think he's moving to Celtic?
Yeah, there has been reports. Tom Bogart has reported that Minnesota interested. Fabrizio Romano has jumped on the bandwagon today, right, with a report mentioning a bunch of other MLS teams as well. The one thing I want to point out here is that MLS teams are not allowed to compete with one another over a signature of a player, right? It's a single entity league, which means that the player signs a contract with the league, and then the player then plays for the club that he's sort of assigned to. Is the easiest way to say that. So he is linked to Minnesota United. Ignore all these other MLS teams for now. As long as Minnesota United are interested in the player, they hold his MLS rights, and they're the only ones able to negotiate with him, right? So having said all that, maybe you can then add your bits on Celtic, because I'm not 100% sure what their price category is. But Minnesota United, MLS teams do have they're all backed by billionaire owners. The amount of money that they can spend is often higher to a limited extent to what teams in the Bundesliga can pay for these kind of players, because they have certain slots that they call the designated player slots. Some of our American listeners will probably roll with their eyes by now because they know all of this, but I know the questioner is from Northern Ireland, so probably not aware. And which means that for this designated player spot, they can spend as much on the player in terms of wage and in transfer fee as they want to, without getting a maximum charge on their salary cap, right? It's a salary cap league, which means they could probably outspend Mainz if they really wanted to, if they really wanted this profile of player. My understanding is he's still owned by Nottingham. He was one of those 5,000 players that Nottingham signed last summer, and then loaned out to their other club, Olympiacos, right? So I'm not quite sure how the ownership structure here works. How much money Nottingham want in the end of the day is very interesting as well, because I think their principle was to buy as many players as possible, use the few that they need, and then sell on the rest with a profit, which is probably also bad news for Mainz. So I think if Minnesota really want a guy and he wants to go to MLS, it'd be very difficult for Mainz to compete on a financial level in terms of salary. Another factor here is I think taxes are quite a lot lower in Minnesota than they are in Germany. So he would pay a lower tax rate as well, which for some players is important, right? If you make 5-6 million and you don't have to pay a high tax on it, that salary goes up even more. So these are factors. But on the other hand, if the player wants to stay in a top 4 league, then Minnesota can pay as much as they want to, because they're not in a top 4 league. Mainz is, and in the long term, he could probably increase his market value a lot more playing for Mainz than for Minnesota. I'm just curious. Do you think Celtic could outbid Mainz in this, Stefan? You have a bit of a better handle on them than I do.
Yeah, I was just thinking about this actually, because I think Mainz have actually been quite upfront about it. I think Heidel basically said, they basically valued him at under 3 million euros, and they basically said that the rumours coming from the other clubs that are interested is that they're willing to pay more than that. Now Celtic have they've Ange Postecoglou, who's been the head coach for a couple of seasons now, and he came from Australia and came from Asian football in particular, actually Japanese football. And with that has been this kind of new wave of kind of players from the Far East. And I would be surprised if this guy is undoubtedly on their radar. And if I'm not mistaken, they're also looking to sell. They've got a Greek forward, Giacomakis, which goes how much I've said his name this season, Giacomakis, which I think I've probably butchered it, to be honest with you. But anyway, he's expected to move on in January as well for quite a large sum of money. So I wouldn't be surprised if they use that to maybe sign this guy. But I guess it just depends to be seen whether he wants to move to MLS or whether he thinks a move to Celtic might be better for his profile. And I'm only saying that just because there's quite a lot of Japanese players who've made the move to Scotland recently that has improved their careers in terms of their standing. So Celtic does seem to be a useful stepping stone. But either way, it looks as though Mainz are probably going to get pushed out of this one. And I'd go so far as to say that it's maybe not that big of a deal, because it looks like Burkhart might be coming back sooner than anticipated. Having said that, he hasn't been in great form this season, so even once he does return from injury, he's going to have to kind of turn something round there. Or Svensson himself's maybe going to have to change something to get more out of him. Yeah, I think we'll just maybe leave that one as that, unless you've got anything else to add about Minnesota.
No, I think that covers it well. Maybe the only thing that I thought interesting, that Celtic striker you mentioned, and not even going to attempt to say his name, is also linked with a move to MLS.
It's a small world after all.
Nothing to add on Mainz. Yeah, it's not a big football world. Is not that big.
Yeah, it's I was actually thinking about that today because there's a Japanese player who's moving to Motherwell, which is a club just outside Glasgow where Celtic are based. And I found that it's so peculiar that we have this kind of link between players in Japan and Scotland moving back and forth. I thought there's no other industry in the world where you'd have that direct link between people thinking, well, should I give up Tokyo for Glasgow? Who knows? Anyway, our final question and our subscriber question is on RB Leipzig, which I referenced earlier in the show, Manu. And I think it's quite an interesting one, which I think is a good one to kind of wrap up the show. I know people have issues with RB Leipzig and how they're run as a club. They seem to be the only club trying to beat Bayern and make the league more interesting. I have no clue what Dortmund is trying to do. I cannot believe the lack of quality they have compared to 2015. Let me know if I'm wrong on this take. And he says, thanks from Asheville, NC. I'm pretty sure I got pulled up on this last time and I tried to guess what NC stands for. Any ideas?
NC? No, yeah. I don't know.
NC, Asheville, NC. I'm actually going to Google this because I think.
Asheville, NC. Yeah, that's North Carolina. I should know this because I've been there.
Oh, well, there we go then.
I went there. I went there for a wedding in April. Yeah, sorry, I was zoning out there for a second. It's now Asheville, North Carolina.
Could this potentially be the groom from the wedding you were at earlier on?
Oh, I hope not. I hope not. If Nate starts asking questions on this podcast, then I'm gonna throw out the phone. Hardcore Chelsea supporter. He has a beef with me, anyways.
Let's talk about the question he asks. Then he says, "Are Dortmund far worse than they were in 2015, and why are they so much worse in the transfer window than RB Leipzig?"
Well, I think with anything you can say about RB Leipzig and the ownership model, there is also the truth that they have done things a lot more in a way that is a lot more forward thinking than most other teams in German football, right? They have a very strong analytics department. I think one of the analytics guys is actually a regular listener to the show. So, hey, how's it going? And they have a very good training center. They have this, and again, you can think about it any way you want, but they do own multiple clubs. Red Bull is, as a company, not just successful in soccer, but also in other sports, like hockey, like all the skiing competitions. They do a lot of, extreme sports, and a lot of these sports require a strong analytical background of mind, and they've sort of transferred that knowledge to football. And I think that is really important here, that they have sort of spearheaded this analytical revolution in German football. Bayern Munich, of course, do it now too. Their analytics department is quite large too. But Leipzig is the one that started it and has an extensive network with this. And so I think they're just better at transfers because they are not, I mean, when you look at the amount of money that they're spending, it's not earth-shattering by any means, right? They're just faster oftentimes than other clubs. And I think what is also really fascinating, this is just not Leipzig, it's also Salzburg. Salzburg has an even bigger drainage because Salzburg has to deal with the Premier League clubs rating them, and Leipzig also taking the cream of the crop every year, right? From Salzburg. And they also do this. They always seem not just 2 transfers ahead, but sometimes 3 or 4, right? They know that, we have this guy, we're going to lose him. We're going to lose this replacement eventually too. So we have to have a replacement for a replacement. And Leipzig are very much in the same vein. And, we all wondered why they were going in for Timo Werner in the summer. Why they signed then on top of that Benjamin Seschko from Salzburg. Because they knew at that point already that Christopher Nkunku was going to leave. And this gives them an entire year to sort of prepare. And I think the moves that you've seen, they are just preemptive moves already for something else that's probably going to happen. Now we talked about early in the show, Konrad Laimer is going to leave. Manu Kone is going to come in. This just seemed to be always a step ahead of it. And that's really good planning. And in Max Eberl, they have signed a guy who has done this at Gladbach. At Gladbach, though, he always had to generate large transfer sums just to keep the club going. At Leipzig, he can generate large transfer sums, but he doesn't have to, right? He has the luxury of signing a player and say like, okay, this guy we're actually going to keep. This guy we're going to buy and move on because we already have this other guy who's potentially better, right? And I think that's going to make them even more dangerous on the transfer market. I think in many ways, I talked to an industry source yesterday about this. Leipzig is the only club that can sort of go in for the kind of category transfers that Bayern Munich are looking at, right? Because even Bayern Munich are now looking in that top shelf for young talent. They were in for David Raum, for example, and that top shelf for the biggest talent in Germany and abroad is very expensive. And in some ways, Dortmund are already kind of priced out of that segment. And it's really just Leipzig and Bayern Munich that are in there. And I think that makes them, in the medium term at least, and we're going to find out very quickly whether they're competitive, if not on match day 16, that is, right? When they are playing Bayern Munich. And I think in a nutshell, that's where it all comes from. They're just a really well-run club with a really good infrastructure that has embraced certain modern approaches far faster and earlier than other teams.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. They certainly are a club who have embraced analytics, embraced the kind of data revolution in football, and they were able to kind of do it at scale because they're also part of a much bigger network. A network which they obviously lean on quite heavily, as you mentioned there. I mean, the number of players who've moved from Salzburg to Leipzig is quite heavy. They've missed out on some big ones. Obviously, Erling Haaland's the most obvious one. So it's not a kind of full... It's not like they kind of put a gun to these guys' heads and make the move to Saxony, but it just so happens that, Leipzig have put together a project which a lot of players are happy to move on to. I think there's two other things that we definitely have to mention here. I think number one is that they also have just a buttload of money. There's no two ways about this. Leipzig are well funded by the Red Bull company. So much so that, although they don't really, if I'm not mistaken, they don't actually publish their financial results, but I actually wouldn't be surprised if they're now making more money than Dortmund, or at the very least they're spending more money than Dortmund. I know in Transfermarkt, we have them higher than Dortmund in terms of transfer fees paid. And I also wouldn't be surprised if they're probably paying a higher wage bill. If you want to compare Dortmund and Leipzig right now, you only have to look at the fact that Leipzig already have 3 or 4 players in their squad that can replace Christopher Nkunku. They've also got Sesko arriving in the summer, who they would have promised a healthy fee. And in comparison, Dortmund are haggling with Moukoko over the sake of 2 or 3 million euros a year. So they are in very different situations, and I think that also kind of bleeds into the cultures at the club as well. Now, if you look on paper, and if you just kind of look at the surface level, they're kind of in the same position. They're both 2 big clubs in Germany. They both make a reasonable amount of money. They both struggle to beat Bayern to the league title, and they're both routinely rated by the Premier League for their players who want to move on and play at a higher level and challenge for silverware. But I think the difference between Leipzig and Dortmund is that where Dortmund have accepted that fact and actually have baked it into their revenue system to the extent that Dortmund know that they have to get top price for Jude Bellingham, for Jadon Sancho, and even for Erling Haaland, even though they had to promise him a release clause to get him at the club in the first place. I'm not entirely sure that's the case at RB Leipzig. I know Leipzig do have to kind of make the same promises to these players. They promised Christopher Nkunku they'd sell him at a set price. They probably promised Josko Guardiola something very similar, that he'll be able to move, next season, the summer after this coming one. But I don't think that's something that they have to kind of run by their accountants the same way that Dortmund do. And I think that also then leads to a different culture at the club. I think anyone who's outside of a Bayern Munich fan would love to see Dortmund challenging for league title as they once did under Jurgen Klopp. But it just strikes me as the culture of that club's very different. They're absolutely petrified of labeling themselves as the de facto competitors to Bayern. I think, Manu, you've even spoke to people at the club directly for this podcast and for our newsletter, and certainly the impression I think you reported back to me. And then if you go to Leipzig, it's a completely different situation. They come from a much larger kind of sporting culture, sporting culture, as in the Red Bull, the Red Bull, what you call it, franchise or whatever. They're very much a case of pushing the boundaries, breaking new ground, etc., etc. And that certainly seems to be the case when you talk to people at Leipzig. They're very ambitious, whereas Dortmund, I just don't get the same impression of them.
Yeah, I think with Leipzig, I mean, Red Bull is used to win in every sport that they're in, right? Whether it's the hockey, whether it's Formula One, whether it's skiing, they're used to winning, and I think that they actually have a plan to win with. And I mean, obviously, they win in football as well with Salzburg quite a bit. I think they have a plan to be winning with Leipzig as well. I think that is very much a goal that they have. I think they're also just realistic enough that it is not going to happen right away. But I think, they're inching and robbing their way closer and closer to Bayern Munich, which is something you don't really have the sense with Borussia Dortmund. I think that is a huge difference right there, that there seems to be a plan. And I actually, as you were speaking there, I was just kind of going through my head. When was the last transfer that made Leipzig worse? That sold, like a player that they sold, whether it's Naby Keita to Liverpool, they didn't get worse after that.
Julian Nagelsmann.
When they sold Nagelsmann, actually, they stumbled a couple times, but they now probably found the right coach in Marco Rose. Ibrahima Konate and Dayot Upamecano were sold for a lot of money, and Josko Gvardiol looks better than either one of them. They've already lined up a replacement for Josko Gvardiol should he leave eventually. I mean, when was the last transfer that made them significantly worse? Other than maybe Nagelsmann. For a short moment. But other than that, like this Konrad Laimer deal to Bayern Munich, like people were saying, oh, look, Bayern Munich are raiding Leipzig again. They're making a team worse. It's like, Laimer has barely played this year. Like, he's not going to move the needle. Either club.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it, isn't it? For Leipzig to be in that position, they obviously have to have the money to buy these players, to offer them the wages that are competitive, but they also have to have the intelligence, they have to have the data, they have to have analytics to be 2 or 3 steps ahead, and that's exactly kind of what Leipzig are doing. So, as the kind of questioner points out, a lot of people have issues with Leipzig as a club, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate problem to have. Yeah. But you cannot do anything. You have to kind of admire the fact that they are trying to outsmart the opposition in the Bundesliga. I'd go so far as to say that they have now eclipsed Dortmund in that regard. They should finish above them in the league. I know they haven't for a while now. I mean, well, technically that's not true, but they've obviously not really got any closer to a Bundesliga title, and since obviously Nagelsmann was there, I suppose. But I think from a sporting point of view, they probably are just about eclipsed Dortmund in that regard, in the sense that I do look at those squads and expect, and would say Leipzig should finish above Dortmund. I'll go so far as to say that. And obviously I'd kind of expect them to do exactly that this season. And they're now obviously working towards trying to outsmart Bayern, which, we can spend another 45 minutes talking about how important the league is for the league to have a club like that right now, or a team like that, or a sporting project like that. Whether it's ideal for the culture of German football or not, it's probably a different debate. But I think that's certainly what it comes down to, and why they have eclipsed Dortmund. They have the money to challenge Dortmund, but they also have the analytics and the brains to outsmart them too. And I think they're putting both to good use.
Yeah, I think I've written that in a Substack late last year, that there is executives of other Bundesliga teams that wish they were a little bit more like Leipzig, and I mean, Bobic kind of alluded to it a little bit in his interview too, that sometimes it's easier when you just have one owner. Not many executives in German football would admit this, but Leipzig have the luxury of just, if they want to do something, they just do it. They don't have to ask if the fan base, I mean, there is lots of Leipzig fans, but they have no say. And that sometimes makes things easier, right? And I think too, what's really important, and this was also pointed out to me by people working in the Bundesliga who, not surprisingly, want to stay anonymous because of the way the team is sometimes perceived within Germany, is that if the league wants to sell itself internationally, they need RB Leipzig to compete and beat Bayern. And I think even people with Bayern would be the first to admit this. That's just the reality. Within Germany, if Leipzig win the title or not, we saw it with the DFB Pokal. Lots of people were upset, right? But at the end of the day, people still watch. So, within Germany, there might be an uproar, but abroad, it would actually probably be perceived as something positive. And that's where the league needs to sell itself. The Bundesliga will always automatically sell itself in Germany. That's not what this is about. This is about selling the league abroad. And for that, it needs Leipzig.
Yeah, and we perhaps now live in a world where the kind of people that would tune in to watch German football abroad probably have more of a kind of warm feeling towards Red Bull because they're maybe F1 fans, for example, So we might live in a weird world where Red Bull is a probably more notable and more kind of household name than maybe Borussia Dortmund. But anyway, I think we should probably call it quits there, Manu, because we could quite happily stumble down that rabbit hole and talk about the importance of marketing and sports business for the next half an hour. But I think we'll wrap it up there. And have you got anything to add before we pack it up?
Yeah, as always, the show is brought to you by Bet Online, right? Thank you for everyone for subscribing. The feedback of the Bobic interview and then the recap that we did for our subscribers was quite excellent, Stefan. So thank you for everyone reaching out, and I'm glad people enjoyed it. I thought it was an excellent interview as well. And I kind of want to point out that a lot of things that we discussed at the tail end of this show also were discussed in the Bobic and the Bobic interview, but also the Bobic kind of like feedback show that we did, right? So if you're interested in that, give that a listen.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Always worth looking back through the last kind of podcast, because we do quite a lot of them right now. We do at least 3 a week, so it's quite easy to miss them, especially if you're not subscribed to the main show. But yeah, as ever, thanks again for listening. As Manu said, the show is sponsored by Bet Online, and we will be back next week with the main show. But until then, we'll speak to you later. So goodbye.
Auf Wiedersehen.
In Sicht.
What's up, folks? Anthony Armstrong here, former NFL receiver and host of Believe in Commanders. And with the basketball season here, you can now pick combo projections across football and basketball from the Specials League. It's a league specifically created for combo projections that includes 2 or more players from different sports or leagues. Make your way over to prizepicks.com/believe and use the code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for a first deposit match up to $100. You must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details. Pick more or pick less. It's that easy. Prize Picks.